Welcome to English Mirror. Today we discuss Art as Technique by Viktor Shklovsky. Viktor Shklovsky was a Russian and Soviet literary theorist, critic, writer, and pamphleteer. He is one of the major figures associated with Russian formalism. Let's analyze the essay Art as Technique by Viktor Shklovsky in detail. If we start to examine the general laws of perception, we see that as perception becomes habitual, it becomes automatic. Habituation explains the principles by which, in ordinary speech, we leave phrases unfinished and words half expressed. In this process, ideally, realized in algebra, things are replaced by symbols. Complete words are not expressed in rapid speech. Their initial sounds are barely perceived. This characteristic of thought not only suggests the method of algebra, but even prompts the choice of symbols, such as letters, especially initial letters. By this algebraic method of thought, we apprehend objects only as shapes with imprecise extensions. We do not see them in their entirety, but rather recognize them by their main characteristics. We see the object as though it were enveloped in a sack. We know what it is by its configuration, but we see only its silhouette. The object perceived thus in the manner of prose perception fades and does not leave even a first impression. Ultimately, even the essence of what it was is forgotten. Such perception explains why we fail to hear the prose word in its entirety. The process of algebraization, the over-automatization of an object, permits the greatest economy of perceptive effort. Habituation devours work, clothes, furniture, one's wife, and the fear of war. If the whole complex lives of many people go on unconsciously, then such lives are as if they had never been. And art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object is not important. After we see an object several times, we begin to recognize it. Art removes objects from the automatism of perception in several ways. Here I want to illustrate a way used repeatedly by Leo Tolstoy, that he makes the familiar seem strange by not naming the familiar object. He describes an object as if he were seeing it for the first time, an event as if it were happening for the first time. In describing something, he avoids the accepted names of its parts and instead names corresponding parts of other objects. For example, in Shame, Tolstoy defamiliarizes the idea of flogging in this way: to strip people who have broken the law, to hurl them to the floor, and to rap on their bottoms with switches, and after a few lines, to lash about on the naked buttocks. The familiar act of flogging is made unfamiliar both by the description and by the proposal to change its form without changing its nature. Tolstoy uses this technique of defamiliarization constantly. The narrator of Cold for example, is a horse, and it is the horse's point of view rather than a person's that makes the content of the story seem unfamiliar. Anyone who knows Tolstoy can find several hundred such passages in his work. His method of seeing things out of their normal context is also apparent in his last works. Tolstoy described the dogmas and rituals he attacked as if they were unfamiliar, substituting everyday meanings for the customarily religious meanings of the words common in church ritual. Now, having explained the nature of this technique, let us try to determine the approximate limits of its application. I personally feel that defamiliarization is found almost everywhere form is found. An image is not a permanent referent for those mutable complexities of life, which are revealed through it. Its purpose is not to make us perceive meaning, but to create a special perception of the object. It creates a vision of the object instead of serving as a means for knowing it. The perception of disharmony in a harmonious context is important in parallelism. The purpose of parallelism, like the general purpose of imagery, is to transfer the usual perception of an object into the sphere of new perception, that is, to make a unique semantic modification. We find material obviously created to remove the automatism of perception. The author's purpose is to create the vision which results from that de-automatized perception. A work is created artistically so that its perception is impeded and the greatest possible effect is produced through the slowness of the perception. As a result of this lingering, the object is perceived not in its extension in space, but, so to speak, in its continuity. Thus, poetic language gives satisfaction. According to Aristotle, poetic language must appear strange and wonderful. And in fact, it is often actually foreign. The Sumerian used by the Assyrians, the Latin of Europe during the Middle Ages, the Arabism of the Persians, the old Bulgarian of Russian literature, or the elevated, almost literary language of folk songs. The language of poetry is then a difficult, roughened, impeded language. In a few special instances, the language of poetry approximates the language of prose. But this does not violate the principle of roughened form. The usual poetic language for Pushkin's contemporaries was the elegant style of Derwin, but Pushkin's style, because it seemed trivial then, was unexpectedly difficult for them. He used the popular language as a special device for prolonging attention, just as his contemporaries generally used Russian words in their usually French speech. In the light of these developments, we can define poetry as attenuated, tortuous speech. Poetic speech is formed speech. Prose is ordinary speech, economical, easy, proper. The goddess of prose is a goddess of the accurate, facile type, of the direct expression of a child. The rhythm of prose is an important automatizing element. The rhythm of poetry is not. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked the video, please share and subscribe.